Yes, YouTube, I hope you're all doing well. So in today's video, I've cut out one of the chapters from my Mixdown course, where we'll be looking at how I mix down my drums and my percussion. If you want to get the whole Mixdown course, then you can use the link below. I highly recommend it. It's much more advanced and technical than the free Mixdown course that is on this channel. Anyways, I'll let you watch this episode from the Mixdown course, and I will see you very soon. Okay, so now we're on to chapter 4, which is drums and percussion processing. Now, really, if we'd done a good job earlier on, like I was talking about, our drums and percussion should already sound pretty good, as we've chosen high quality samples that work well together from a tonality and frequency point of view. So our main goal within this section is to really just add a bit more colour, add a bit more depth to the drums and percussion, and glue the samples together. Obviously, we're pulling samples from a variety of different sample packs that originate from different instruments and different drum sounds. So we kind of want to pull them together and make them sound a bit more unison. But at the same time, we don't want to overdo that, because then we can really kill the dynamics of the drums. So first thing we're going to do with the drums is actually just take a listen to them individually. By individually, I mean claps, hats, top loops, and decide if we need to make any adjustments to improve the sounds, much like we were with the kick and the low end. A very common problem that I see a lot of people doing is they start going through and processing every single hat, every single clap, and every single drum loop or percussion loop that there is. You're kind of just doubling up on your work here. You're much better off grouping those set elements together. So for example, group together your closed hi-hats, your open hi-hats, your top loops, or your claps. Group up your percussion into different sections. So if I open up the percussion, we can see here I've got tribal percussion, perk 1 and a perk 2. That means I can just listen to them as a collective and then decide if they need processing in any individual way. So for example, that clap, I think it could do with having an extra bit of brightness to it. So easy fix, we can try with a saturator. Remember to gain stage like we were in the previous step. So I'm going to turn the kickstart on for these ones. If you are unaware of what kickstart is just a sidechain plugin. I much prefer using it compared to a sidechain compressor, mainly because it's so much more easier and quicker to use. I also feel like these ones could be glued together slightly, but not too much, because we do a lot of glue compression on the whole drum group. And I feel that these closed hi-hats could just be kind of brought closer together, make them feel a bit more natural with one another. A really easy way of doing that is with a Transient Shaper. Now, Transient Shapers are effectively compression for dummies, is the way I sort of put it. If you want to boost the attack and make the front of the sounds more prominent, then you boost the attack. If you want to do the opposite and make them more subtle and push the attacks further back in the mix, then you bring that down. If you want to shorten the sounds and help glue them together, which is what we want to do, bring the sustain down. Or if I wanted to do the opposite and really kind of bring out each individual sound, then I bring the sustain up. So super easy tool to use. And what I like about this is because we're not necessarily compressing, we're not really killing too much of the dynamics, and it's very easy to shape sounds with this as well. And I'm going to clean these ones up with a fab filter. So what I'm doing with this fab filter is just a bit of creative EQing. Within FabFilter Pro Q3, it has the dynamic feature. So effectively, when the frequencies hit a certain threshold, the EQ curve then just lifts up. You can control this to go even higher, or you can even reverse it. It's a really, really great tool just to add an extra bit of movement to the frequencies. For example, if I turn all of these off, it really just gives everything that extra bit of pop and sparkle. Main reason for that is because I've chosen certain frequencies that will increase that pop and sparkle. So this pop here in that kind of mid-range, that's just adding a bit more weight to the sound. And then the high end with the dynamic shelf going up is going to really add that sparkle. This is a really nice technique I like using on a lot of my drum channels, is a dynamic lift within the high end. It just really adds a lot of air and kind of freedom to the top end. We also noticed a bit of a resonance there and just removed that one slightly. We need to gain stage again. So we're about 1 decibel up. So we can find the open hats in the track. And that open hat sounds good as it is, so I'm not going to process it unnecessarily. Top loops, again, they're sounding really good. Maybe they could be brightened up slightly. So I'm going to use a saturator again. A good thing about a saturator as well is that we're going to end up running each of these top loops into this saturator. So then what I imagine's happening is the frequencies from each individual channel, so channel 24, 25 and 26, are then all going into the saturator and then all kind of getting merged together. So you get a natural bit of glue from using stuff like saturation or distortion or Ableton's Overdrive, or just any plugin in fact that adds a bit of analog character. You're going to get that natural bit of gluing without having to compress and really kind of control the dynamics too much. And that's a really good example of what I mean. Okay, really happy with all of that. Before we start processing the drum bus though, we are going to set up a drum reverb. Now, this isn't essential by any means. Some people like leaving their drums dry with no reverb, and that's completely fine. Personally, I like to go in between. I don't like going too much reverb, nor do I like going no reverb at all. Thankfully, most reverb plugins will have very good drum room presets in there, so I would just recommend using one of those. For me, I use this Waves IRL full stereo reverb. It's very old school, and again it's got that kind of like analog character to it. Now there's two ways you can do this. You could send all of the drum bus to the reverb and then tweak to your liking, but personally I like doing it individually. Just gives me that extra bit of control then, and if you really want to go one step further, you can do it on every individual hi-hat. So we're going to do that just for the best mix possible. And how I like to find the sweet spot for reverb is bring it all the way up so it's really noticeable, and then just dial it back down so I can barely notice it. Okay, really happy with that, and we can take a listen to what it's sounding like with our low end as well. All sounding good. Maybe we need to readjust some levels again, but that's completely fine. But before we do that, we will process the drum bus. So this is my go-to drum bus that I use plugin wise. We're going to work through what each one does. But in effect, you can use any plugin on the drum bus, but the order in which I use them is effectively sort of creative or shaping with an EQ, saturation distortion, a combination of everything through a mix rack, dynamic shaping, which is typically compression, and then an EQ just to polish things up and tidy it all up. So first thing we want to do is find a peak volume to go off. So I'm going to go for that, which is the 11.9 on that first clap. And the first plugin we're going to use is something that may look familiar, because this is the mid-range plugin of the PTech EQ that we're using on the last chapter in the low-end chapter. Now, this works practically very similar, but there is no attenuation in this one. We will use this plugin in the exact same way. That we'll have a look at our fab filter. And then we can decide from there what frequencies to pick to boost. So by looking at it, I think 500 and the 3K range, which it's already set up on, is probably going to be about right. So we can turn these on and start really cranking these up. Because we're working more with mid and high range now, the frequencies become a bit less fragile. So we can really drive the effect of the plugins that we're going to use to get the most from them. And you can hear the difference in that one already. Yes, it's adding a lot of character, but by just boosting that kind of mid-range with the 500 and the higher end with the 3K, we're really bringing that sort of punch and life into the drums now. And you can see it in the fab filter as well, but if you did it before and after. Okay, so let's use the effect rack now by Soundtoys. And the plugin we're going to use is the Decapitator. Thankfully, there is an absolutely amazing preset in here called Drum Fattener 1. Works every single time. It's usually set up perfectly as well. You may need to adjust the tone. Effectively, dark will kind of roll off the high end, and bright will add a bit more brightness to it by adding more high end. I just find in between is usually about right. And obviously we've added loads of gain with this plugin. I still like driving this quite hard so I can get the most effect from the Decapitator instead of doing a smaller drive. And then I can gain stage this one back in. So next up is a virtual mix rack by Slate Digital. You could use the SSL, they have a drum strip, and I believe Waves will have the equivalent of this as well. In effect, all it is a series of different effects, compressors, EQs, saturators, all of that kind of stuff. And they just help glue the drums together. Granted, this is fairly new to me, so I still don't actually know my way around this plugin, but that's the beauty of having high quality plugins like this, is that the presets are usually very good, so you shouldn't need to necessarily understand how to set this up perfectly, and you can just be a bit reliant on the presets. So the preset I always use is this Drum Bus Big Vintage. Which sounds great. I just need to gain stage that. So unfortunately I couldn't see any gain knobs within the virtual mix rack, so I just use an external utility to get me back down to the correct level. So next up is our compressor. So for compression, we're going to want a fairly fast attack to sort of capture peaks, but nothing too crazy, and a very quick release, so the compressor releases the compression very quickly, so then hopefully it can catch that next transient to control them. And on the drum bus, I'm going to look to do a very small amount of compression. I'm going to aim for about 1 to 2 decibels of gain reduction. This is because in one of the later stages, we're going to use parallel compression for our drums as well. Next up, we can use a Transient Shaper. So the reason for this is we can then just shape the transients or the dynamics of the drums that extra step further. The reason you want to do this afterwards is because if we've got any nasty kind of peaks within our drums, that compressor is kind of evening out the playing field. So then the Transient Shaper is working more on an even playing field instead of spiking maybe attacks that were already too hard. So all of that sounding good, and now the last thing we can just do is tidy everything up with an EQ, cut out any unnecessary frequencies, have a look for maybe some resonances if there's any showing, and give certain frequencies a boost if they are still lacking after that processing. So there's a few resonances popping up, which is great because we can go over how to control these resonances and to talk about good resonances and bad resonances. Now, a lot of people will just see these spikes within the frequencies and automatically make the EQ go down and invert it and get rid of them. Now what they're doing is completely okay, but by doing that too much, you can actually kill the characteristics of the sound. A good example of this is a 909 open hi-hat. Has some harsh resonances in there. If you actually get rid of all of these resonances, it doesn't sound like a 909 hi-hat anymore. So then the question comes to, well, how do I know if it's a good resonance or a bad resonance? For me, I actually boost to tell if it's a good resonance or a bad resonance. So we've got two really good examples here. If I turn these off, we can see two quite harsh looking spikes with both of these ones here. So if I turn these back on, and we just have a listen to this one. That is the sound of a resonance, that really harsh, quite squirrely sound. That's what you get more in the high end. If you've got any resonances a bit further down, almost sound a bit like a whale underneath water, like a really scratchy kind of sound. And even if we go to check the high end one, same sort of thing, it's just obviously a lot higher in frequencies. Now to tell if this is a good resonance or a bad resonance, you want to start boosting them. So if we start with this one here, we're going to start boosting this and go up and up and up until the point where we can hear that horrible scratchy sound within the mix. So I've gotten to about nearly 12 decibels and I can only just start to hear it. So if I'm boosting by 12 decibels and I can only just start to hear it, then that resonance probably isn't much as a problem as it kind of looks it is. So what I can just do is just do a really, really small cut to cover my back. So it still looks like a resonance, but I think it's a good resonance. But let's make a tiny little dip just to cover ourselves. Now this one on the other hand, if I start boosting this, you can instantly hear it. So I know that's probably a bad resonance, so I can make a much deeper cut to get rid of that one. And there we go, that is the drum processing all done and dusted. Thankfully, percussions follow very similar to the drum. So all we've got to do for the percussion is the exact same process. So listen to the percussion, check them individually, make sure that we're happy with the individual groups, and then process the group as a whole. And you can literally use the exact same plugins and the exact same order of them to get the same result. So because I've already been over this, I'm going to whiz through this so you can still see what I'm doing. And there you go, you can really see how quick that process can become if you just know how to use your plugins. This is why I favour just having a few plugins and knowing how to use them, because you just improve that workflow and efficiency.